So over time, I have seen some of the same mistakes in leases, and especially for people who buy like apartments and they get, either estoppels or like really old leases. Recently, I saw the one and only lease, which was from 1997. And one of the things that I see consistently in leases is that there's some key bits of information that are missing that should not be missing from a lease. So in this video, I'm going to go over 6 things that should be in your lease and addressed in your lease. And I'll go over kind of why it's really important to have this. So to get into it, first, identify the people that will be living in the residence. So a lot of times I'll see like one person on the lease. It'll be like Jane Doe, and then it'll say 2 adults, 1 child. Well, that's like little to no information. What it should be is the tenants on the lease, who are the people that will be financially responsible, ideally jointly and severally, meaning that irrespective of one moving out, the other one is still going to be fully responsible for the lease. So let's say Jane Doe, John Doe move in, John Doe moves out, Jane Doe is still going to be responsible for the full rent, irrespective of the fact that John Doe is no longer there. So that's one part. So you want to have the 2 people that are going to be financially on the hook on the lease. And then you want to put as authorized occupants the people that are going to be authorized. That would be in addition to the tenants named. So what's common is you have Jane Doe, John Doe, then you have the children. So let's say you have Timmy Doe. You want to have Timmy Doe on there, and then you want to have his birth date because he's a minor child, and so you can track when he becomes an adult. Then let's say you have, maybe someone's, the mother-in-law, one of the tenants, family members is moving in. Then you want to have that person, additional authorized occupant, and then their name. So what ends up happening is tenants will come and go from the unit. And if you just have like 2 adults and you see 2 adults, they could just be 2 adults. But if you're someone who's buying a property or you're stepping into it, you want the people on the lease to be the people in the unit. And if there's changes throughout time, you want to document that in writing, potentially signing a new lease, correcting the names, or correcting who the occupants are going to be. It also matters because depending on where you're at, there might be laws about children who become adults that might result in a rent increase that you're allowed to do to account for the fact that now they're adults. So you want to keep that in mind. You want to identify everyone by name who's supposed to be living there. And if there's any changes, then it has to be authorized in writing by the landlord. So that's one thing. I am very surprised by the number of leases that don't have that kind of information. And if you're a landlord and you have a property and that's kind of the lease that you got, you're inherited, going forward, you want to correct that in all your leases. Next, you want to deal with parking. Parking doesn't seem like it would be a big issue, but it happens where, let's say you have, an apartment complex and there's parking garages or parking spaces. Tenants over time, if no one's regulating, might potentially start using more spaces. And if the lease doesn't identify or talk about that, then it's really hard to say that they can or cannot use it. And potentially, if you take the parking away, it might be considered a reduction in services. So you might have to even give a rent reduction. So if you have parking on site, either in a garage or some sort of parking space, you want that in the lease. So if it's going to be included in your lease, you identify that and ideally number the spot that they're going to be assigned. And you want to identify how many spaces. They're entitled to 1 parking space, space B. Landlord can change the space, reserve the right to change the space, the assignment of the spaces. It might be in the future that something has to change. So you want to identify that. Now, typically, if parking is not included in the lease, then you would do a separate parking agreement, and your lease would say parking is not included in the lease. Should it be provided, to be provided under a separate agreement. And then in that, you want to provide the parking space, or if there's more spaces, and then the car that's going to be parked in it. So if you have more than 1 space, you might want to have separate parking agreements. 1 for space A and the car that's going to be allowed to be parked in it. 1 for space B, car that's allowed to be parked in it. And make sure that the tenants maintain current registration and insurance. And that the car is in operating order. So you want to have a really good parking agreement. For any of these things, I do have template agreements that you can purchase that address lease. So I have a really good lease agreement, a parking agreement, and a pet agreement, which is going to lead me to my next point. Identify animals. So even if it's an ESA and a service animal that you can't potentially charge for, or a pet, which you usually can, you want to identify them. So if the lease says no pets, subject to a separate agreement in writing, you want to have some sort of pet agreement, or in the lease, you're going to want to identify ESA and service animals. In that case, those ones are very specific. You might want to talk to an attorney about how to address in your lease the ESA or the service animal, because you can't charge extra security deposits or extra rents usually if it's an ESA or service animal. But let's just talk about pets. So a lot of the times leases will say no pets, but maybe you change your mind or maybe you're going to allow it. Then if you do allow it, you want to have a separate pet agreement, and then you want to identify the pet. You ideally want to have a photo of the pet, and you want to have proof of its vaccination records. Common pets are cats, dogs, but I've seen guinea pigs, I've seen lizards, I've seen birds. You want to, identify those, because what ends up happening is, again, for a long time, if the tenants have not really been regulated or no one's really been monitoring the situation, which is very common, pets will just appear. And then all of a sudden, you'll have an apartment that has, all these pets in it, and then you don't know where they came from, why they're not identified in a lease. And so, it creates tension between the landlord and the tenant. So if you're at the outset going to allow pets, have a pet agreement. If you at some point or, later on, the tenant goes to you and says, I want to have a pet, do a pet agreement and get all the information, the breed, the name, the weight, the size, all that info, vaccination records. And then you might want to collect an additional security deposit to account for the pet, and you might charge pet rent, depending on the situation. So another one, all monetary obligations. You want to have the base rent in there, you want to have the security deposit in there, and you want to have any charges. So let's say like in LA City, there's SCEP charges and there's RSO charges that passed to the tenant. So you want to identify those. And then if you're going to charge for, parking, what that charge is, pet rent, you want to charge that and identify that. Another one is utilities. So it's very important that you identify in the lease the utilities the tenant will pay for and the utilities the landlord will pay for. A lot of the language is usually tenant pays for all utilities except, and then you put in what the landlord pays for. Maybe water or water heater. I've seen a lot of it where it doesn't identify that, and that's really important because, to make it kind of clear, your initial lease is pretty much the one shot you get at doing a lease. Especially in rent-controlled areas. That lease is the lease for that unit. You can do new leases in the future, but it has to be materially the same as that lease. So what you charge for and what's going to be included and not included carries through the rest of their tenancy there. So you want to make sure you get your utilities right, your parking right, your pets right, and your occupants right, and what the charges are going to be. And rent will go up usually, year over year through rent increases, but you want to make sure you get the base amounts in there and right and identified. Another one that's increasingly more unpopular, especially multifamily, but just across the board, like high-end houses or any houses, is the insurance requirements. So if you're going to have any tenants, commercial separate, but obvious, but this is mostly about residential. For the insurance, you want to make sure that the lease says the insurance requirements and what they are. Renters should have renter insurance for their stuff, and they should also have a liability to landlord insurance, which are two different ones. Usually they'll come under the same policy, but they're two different types of insurances. One is insurance in the event that the tenant's property is destroyed. Another one is insurance in the event that the tenant has damaged the property. So you want to make sure that there's liability to landlord insurance. Typically the amount is $100,000. That's kind of the industry standard. If you need more for some reason, you could ask for more. You should also talk to maybe an insurance broker about renter insurance and liability to landlord insurance, because they might know kind of what makes the most sense for your building and what you should request and what's common. But you definitely should have in your lease the insurance requirements. Then you should definitely make sure you get proof of insurance and that you're named as an additional insured on the policy, because that helps identify you as the person who's the intended beneficiary of these parts of the policy. So have that in the lease, and then make sure you get proof of it, and then make sure that it gets renewed and you get proof of renewal. And then the last thing is you want to have provisions in there on what terminates the lease. So typically, depending on the area, if it's rent control, there's restrictions on how you can terminate, but usually the tenant gives 30-day notice. But in the event that there's some sort of destruction in the property, or certain rules that if broken would result in a pay or quit, or notice to quit, some sort of quit notice, you want to have kind of in your lease what would terminate it. A very common one is in the event of some sort of destruction to the unit, a flood, a fire, something that renders it uninhabitable for an extended period of time, you want to be able to reserve the right to terminate the lease based on that. And another one is having the rules of which, if the tenant breaks, would be grounds to seek rescission of lease and possession of the property. So you want to make sure that you outline those things in the lease. So in the future, let's say something happens, you can go to lease and say, hey, this is already in it. So those are 6 really important things that should be included in your lease. Again, if you need a lease template, I'll put the link below. But it's definitely, if you're a landlord and you have leases, you might want to do a lease audit and check that all this information is there, and then make sure you have up-to-date information on the occupants, the tenant parking, like where they're parking, what vehicle they're parking, and the pets, if any, that are in the unit. It will just save you a lot of headaches. And I say this kind of as a rule of thumb, but if you get any sort of vacancy, you want to do the best that you can for yourself to make sure that you have a really good lease in place going forward, because you're kind of getting a clean slate. You get one shot to kind of correct maybe some of the errors that you've done in the past, or maybe that you inherited if you purchased a property. So I hope that this video was helpful. I will link probably at the top another video that I can't think of on the top of my head, but I think might be helpful for you. I'll put in the end card. I also have a weekly newsletter that is free, and I strongly encourage everybody to subscribe to it. If you're a landlord, I give useful information every Sunday along with relevant real estate news.